Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, good evening. Let me say at the outset, just thank you to Veritas Forum for giving me this opportunity. And let me also say what an incredible privilege it is for me to share the stage here with Dr. Ahuja and Andy Crouch. It's really a very, very grateful for this opportunity. So as said in the introduction, I am the Dean of the School of Business at Seattle Pacific University. And if you were to jump onto our website or grab any of our materials, you would quickly come across our tagline, which is another way of doing business. And we use that to sort of drive home that we are approaching business with a slightly different business philosophy. It has a lot of different pieces to it. If I had more time, I'd love to sort of walk you through it. But probably at the center of it is a question of purpose. And what is the purpose of business in society? And because we're a business school, we tend to look at that question primarily through the frames of a business leader. So we're asking, as we train and teach our students, what should we be telling business leaders, business managers that they should be aiming at or trying to target in their work in the organization? And cutting through an awful lot of the work, let me tell you where we have landed. For us, business purpose comes down to two key factors. First, business exists to create economic value expressed in the form of products and services that will enable the community to flourish. And then second, business exists to provide an opportunity for individuals to express aspects of their identity in meaningful and creative work. And for us, those are really the two pieces. You can sort of shorthand those as good products and meaningful and creative jobs. And that's why business in society and what business leaders should be seeking out. Now, somewhat controversially and probably obviously, we have not included profit maximization, return on investment, shareholder value in our first order statements of purpose. It's of course not because these ideas are it's not because these ideas aren't important. We teach regular business school curriculum, all this stuff in terms of efficiencies and all of that. But the difference for us is that we are teaching profit primarily as a means, not as an end. That is, profit is the means of attracting the capital to the business that enables the business to do what it's supposed to do, which is to serve, and to serve in these two key respects. The analogy or the metaphor that we often use is to think of it as sort of like blood. If there's not blood circulating in my body, we don't have to have a long conversation about my purpose, because I'm dead. And if there is not profit circulating in a business, we don't have to have a long discussion of business purpose because it's bankrupt. But really, if you think about it, which healthy human being gets up in the morning and says, today, my purpose in living is to pump blood? I mean, it's critically important, but it is not the purpose. The purpose of business is to serve in these two key respects. I actually feel quite passionately about this idea, and I thought in the balance of my sort of opening thoughts here, I would try to share with you two reasons that I have come to believe this and feel so strongly about it. One of them comes out of my background. I came of age, if you want to use that phrase, in the late 60s, early 70s in Berkeley, California. And kind of looking around, there may be a few of you that were here and remember that. The rest of you probably read this in history texts. But at the time, in the late 60s, Berkeley was really one of the hot spots around the country for the anti-Vietnam War movement. We were anti-war, we were anti-draft, we were actually anti-everything. We were anti-police, anti-authority, and absolutely, of course, we were anti-business, deeply anti-business. It was the milieu I grew up in, it was the water I swam in, it was the air I breathed. I could tell you instinctively, at the drop of a hat, all of the evils of business. It was profiting on the war, it was promoting racism, it was raping and pillaging developing world countries and their environments. I knew this stuff very deeply and instinctively. In fact, if you had said to me when I was graduating from high school, if you had said, here's your career path, Jeff, you're going to go to law school, and after that, you're going to spend a good part of your career representing large commercial banks, and then you're going to do corporate finance. And then after that, you'll represent timber companies that are cutting down much of Western Washington. And when you're tired of being a lawyer, you'll switch over and become a dean of a business school. I would have said you were smoking something. And in those days, you almost certainly would have been. But actually, that has been my career path. That has been kind of what I've been on. And a little over a decade ago, I found myself as the dean of the business school. And I realized as I came into that position, I still had all of those deep, instinctive hostility toward business. But I was the dean, and I was supposed to go speak to like Rotary clubs and tell them good things about business. And so I thought, boy, I better go try to find something good about business. And as soon as I began to open that window, open that door, I began to realize that there were tons and tons of things that one could say in terms of the good that business was doing in the world, and even more in my mind, the good that business could continue and perhaps even do more in the world. And so I realized that many of these things I'd been carrying around with me were really just these sort of deep prejudices, often not terribly well founded on facts, or if there was some factual base, typically more than offsetting facts on the other side. And so I became, in fairly short order, a convert. And one thing you should always watch out for is the zeal of a recent convert. But that's what I've become zealous about, the good that business can do and is doing in the world, particularly when I couch it in terms of thinking as business as service. And so that's one of the reasons I am as passionate as I am about this. The other reason I've shared with you tonight is my own Christian faith. I have been a Christian for almost all my life. And take it quite seriously. I'm trying to follow Jesus Christ. I believe in a God who is at work in our world, who is trying to restore peace and justice and trying to make things that are broken whole again. And I take great inspiration from that. When I interviewed for the job as the dean, this was back in 2001, I knew that Seattle Pacific University was a faith-based university. That is, it has an affiliation with the Free Methodist Church. It's just to give you a flavor for what that means. We ask our faculty to be able to subscribe to a broadly ecumenical Christian faith statement. We don't ask that of our students, so we have students of many different faiths and no faiths, very rich dialogue that takes place. But our faculty take within the broad parameters of the Christian faith, that's where they're from. And they take that very seriously. So I was in there interviewing, and there comes a moment in an interview where they stop asking you questions, and they say, "Do you have any questions for us?" It happens in virtually every interview, and I totally blew it by not thinking in advance about what I was going to say at that point. So I'm sitting there sort of stumbling around, and I said, well, you're a Christian business school. What difference does it make that you're Christian? It seemed like a good question. And the response I got was one that I have thought back on a number of times. I think it actually didn't do as much justice to their thinking up to that point, but here's what I thought I heard. They said, well, Jeff, business is business. Kind of everybody has to sort of do business the same way, but because we're Christians, we try to tell our students to be nice. I thought that was kind of pathetic. But I didn't say so in the interview. I actually run into that a fair bit when I meet with Christians in business. I've actually got a name for it now. I call it Enron with a smile. But this notion that somehow business is this immutable force, like gravity, and all that we can do is sort of bring our best selves to it in some fashion. And that's just not true. I mean, business is a social construct, and I think God cares about how it's constructed. And so much of our discussion then as faculty, starting really for about a decade ago, has been around this topic that we've talked about as, it's sometimes referred to as a theology of business. And we've spent a lot of time with business leaders, business academicians, theologians, and have really studied our sacred text, our scriptures, to kind of arrive at various different ways of looking at the business discipline through the lens of a theologically informed way of thinking. And really, I don't have nearly enough time, but basically we've come back to these two purpose statements. That is, we think from God's perspective, business exists and should exist for the purpose of producing goods and services that enable the community to flourish and providing opportunities for individuals to express aspects of their God-given identity in meaningful and creative work. Some of you may have been familiar with the work of Tim Keller as a pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian in New York, a very large church. He said once, and I'm sure I'm butchering it in the paraphrase, but he said, look, there's only two kingdoms in the world. There's the kingdom that seeks to be served and the kingdom that seeks to serve. And God lines up with the second, and I think business lines up with the second. That means I don't think business should be asking so much, how can I get more out of society? And business should be saying more, how can I serve society? How can I contribute? How can I advance the common good? And I actually think this becomes very practical. I think the way we say it to our students is, when you as a business leader are confronting a range of decisions, the first question that you should ask is not, of the various options, which on a risk-adjusted basis is most likely to maximize my ROI, but rather, given the assets that are under my control, given the core competencies of my organization, how can I best deploy these resources to serve? It's a different question. I think many, many times the answer to those two questions will be the same, but not always. And over time, if you ask different questions, you go in different directions. And that becomes very important to me. So I'm delighted for the chance to be here. I'm sure I'm over my time, so I'll sit down and perhaps we can talk about this more during questions. Thanks.
I guess I wouldn't be a business professor if I didn't have a PowerPoint. So I also actually must confess that not only am I very grateful that I've been invited and have the honor to speak to all of you, but as when I was originally approached, I actually indicated that I am probably the most unreligious person that you can find on the earth. So in that sense, my perspective is going to be somewhat different. But it might actually turn out that we're not that far apart. And so I'm looking at the basic idea of, should business play God? And so let me just begin with a couple of slides. As with everything, we prefer numbers, right, if you're in the business school. What I'm showing you here is China's GDP from 1969 to 2010. And look at the period just around 1980 or so. In the early 80s, that's when China decided that it wouldn't just sort of stay with a socialist system, but it would actually adopt business in a wholehearted fashion. I let the numbers speak for themselves because I don't have to do very sophisticated statistical analysis to show you the power of markets when they're left to do what they do best. Let me take another cut at this. In India, the inflection point occurs in the late 80s, early 90s, because that's when the Indian government decided that doing good things only through the social sector or the public sector wasn't enough, and they switched towards markets again. Let me also go to the numbers behind the numbers. And this is a very, very limited picture, but if you look at the Indian context from 1994 to 2010, there's 180 million people who would have been below the poverty line and were pushed above it as potentially as a result of the market reforms there. In China, the growth is even more dramatic. The numbers are 600 million. Just to put it into context, 780 million is probably larger than the population of Western Europe and the United States. So if you're thinking about doing good in the world, well, these are some pretty scary numbers of what this matters and of how that might come about. So in one sense, if the question was, should business play God? The answer is, it already is. And if you want an answer or if you want a perspective on that, ask the people, the hundreds of millions, if not billions, for whom business has pulled the world out of poverty and for whom it has meant an actual meal on the table as opposed to the scraps of it. So if our image is of God as a provider, then business is already playing God in that particular role. Right? And the very simple bottom line here is that markets, that is business, enlarge the pie available for division. But let me take another look at this, of business as God. Turns out that markets create an incredible amount of wealth, because that's what they're designed to do. That's what business is designed to do. It's designed to be super sharp in extracting things, and if it's not good at extracting things, it doesn't do much good. But the problem is, when it extracts those values, it takes no responsibility for, or is not, in a sense, set up to provide a distributional consequence that is also equally fair. And if you look at I just want to point out two statistics or two numbers. We use the Gini index or the Gini coefficient to tell us about how the distribution of income is laid out in a given society. The more unequal the distribution of income, the higher the value of the Gini index. And what is fascinating is that if you look at the numbers for India and China in exactly the same period, while all that wealth is created, the Gini index is also, the Gini coefficient is also jumping up very, very significantly. If you want another statistic that's really interesting, India and China are now two of the countries which have the largest number of billionaires of any country in the world. So it's just second or third behind the United States. But what took the United States 200 years to achieve the number of billionaires, India and China have managed in 20 and 30 years respectively. So there's a component here. So now, of very severe inequality. Now the question is this inequality good or bad? And one could make the case that the inequality is actually good. Why? Because this inequality represents the incentive that engenders creative efforts. If I'm not going to do much better than my fellow man, why should I put in more effort than the fellow man? The second part of it is, it's the surplus that enables risk-taking and entrepreneurship. It's when I have a lot of money, I've created a lot of wealth, that I can afford to take chances. And it's through those chances that innovation gets generated in economies, and through that, progress occurs subsequently. But there is another dimension to this yet, which is, think of this as a third look at the problem of business as God. The problem is that in all this incredible wealth creation, there are a few critical omissions. Not all externalities are priced into the cost that businesses bear. So for instance, we know that global warming or pollution are not included as part of the cost structure. So in a sense, the true profitability of business may actually be far lower than what is conveyed by normal numbers. In other words, business gets credit for a lot more than it actually deserves in some senses, right? And the second part is that a large part of this income sort of generation or value generation is emerging from essentially a faulty initial state. Power distribution is not equitable. Hence, the rules of the game are set up to favor certain players over others, and those rules are then translated into incredible bits of wealth. So the idea is that, in essence, some part of the wealth accruing to business may not be quite deserved, and worse yet, may lead to a perpetuation of undeserved rewards. And that's a problem that one has to deal with for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into right away. But let me bring in a third angle here, which is kind of important. See, globalization has implied that many markets that were hitherto closed to companies from other countries are actually now open. So now you have a Pizza Hut, which dominates not just the US market, but also the Chinese, the Indian, the Vietnamese market, right? And the problem is that as these companies spread across global borders, this is leading to an increasing concentration of economic power in fewer and fewer hands. Now, that's one part of the story. The other part of the story that's very important is that globalization has not proceeded, equally fast on all dimensions. It has actually proceeded much faster for capital than it has for labor. The net result is that capital is free to seek whichever part of the world gives it the best return, but labor doesn't enjoy the same freedom. Hence, if General Motors decides that it finds a far better cost structure in China, it's well placed to move the jobs from here to China, and that's exactly what you would expect a profit-seeking corporation to do, and that's what its capital providers expect it to do. So we notice that open markets, and of course this is obviously gives them additional power in negotiations, not just here, but also in China and vice versa. So open markets create wealth and prosperity for nations, but may also worsen both power and income distribution. So we see that there are two sides to this coin, and unfortunately, as with all coins, they come with both sides together. So now the question is, should business play God? And we know that if our image of God is God the powerful, then business is playing God in this second avatar too. Right? And so the question is not whether business should be playing God. We recognize it's playing God in a couple of different ways. It's how should business play God, or what sort of God should business be? And it could be one that uses its force to provide, or one that uses its power to abuse. And we know from Lord Acton's wonderful line many, many years ago, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what we see in a globalizing world is an incredible concentration of power in the hands of an incredibly small number of corporations. Okay? So what's the solution? Well, we know that there are a bunch of solutions out there, so let me just run through them very quickly. The first is to harness the power of business through regulation. I'd say that's necessary, but it's not sufficient, and maybe neither efficient nor effective. Problem is, you give regulators too much power and you stifle business. It's what I call death by 1,000 paper cuts. Right? Give regulators too little and they are ineffective. Make regulation too complex and you set off an eternal cops and robbers games. The smart lawyers come up with, no disrespect invented, Jeff. The smart lawyers come up with better solutions to get around the laws, then the new laws try to beat the smart lawyers, and so on and so forth, right? The second way to solve the problem is to create countervailing power agencies in society. Could be the press, an active civil society, judiciary. Again, necessary but not sufficient, efficient, or effective. Because for starters, may be controlled by business itself, may itself be open to abuse, but most importantly, it may simply lack the knowledge to actually identify the transgressions. Because a lot of the externalities or abuses that occur under business are not even strictly illegal. Many of them are essentially done by a manager knowingly saying, well, this works for me, so I'm going to go ahead and do it, and it isn't illegal, so who's going to stop me? And again, therefore, see, if you had a world in which you could separate the legal and the moral and keep them in very, very clear boxes, so everything that was illegal was also immoral, maybe this could have worked, but that's not the world we live in, okay? So what is the solution? We're back to the problem, and at least my take on it after thinking about this issue for a variety of, for a fairly long period of time is that extrinsic motivations and external controls are helpful, but eventually there is only one party that knows every transaction and hence every possible transgression. So the ultimate control and motivation has to be internal, right? And it is the decision maker or manager who must realize the full import of their decisions, the inequity of power or the omission of externalities, and it's this person that has to do something to compensate for them or rectify them. And so, what I would suggest is, should business play God? And the answer is yes, but it's the third avatar of business that I want to focus on, which is God the just. That business has to have the power to create wealth. But then, and we don't have very good controls on it externally, so the solution to the problem eventually is that business should also adopt a third dimension of what I would perceive a God-like entity to be, which is having the power to do things in a variety of different ways. It nevertheless chooses to not abuse that power in a variety of ways. So what we are looking for is a manager or a business owner who recognizes and realizes that while a large part of wealth and success is a product of their incredible effort and skill, but then there's another large part, an equally large part, that is an accident of fortune, or worse yet, the product of inefficiencies and inequities in the system. Who recognizes that power in his or her hands is not provided to many others, and the playing field is and will never be equitable. and who also recognizes that with power comes a huge responsibility, but very importantly, who recognizes and factors this into their decision making. And to put it in a succinct frame, what we have to do in some respects is build morality into the manager's mind, because no external solution will ever work to solve this problem. The problem with this solution is it takes me to a world or a realm in which I have no expertise, as I told you earlier. But what little I do know of morality is that essentially to control behavior or promote morality, we know of 6 possible motives, which are essentially the higher numbers represent essentially higher orders of morality. So you do the right thing because you fear punishment by another. We do the right thing because somebody will reward us for it. We do the right thing because we fear disapproval by others. We do the right thing because we might be censured by legitimate authorities if we don't do the right thing. We do the right thing to garner community respect or to avoid community disrespect. And all of those are important. But most importantly, in some senses, what we need from managers is to do the right thing because it makes you uneasy because of the problem of self-condemnation. So somehow we have to move management up through these levels to level 6, which, if I'm not an authority on this business, but Kohlberg does tell me that most people or many people don't ever reach that level. So that makes it a practical problem to be resolved in the context of society and, from my perspective, business education. So the question is, how do we build morality? Well, you could do it through family, school, religion. The problem, the way I look at it, is I teach adults. So is it already too late to bring this idea in some sense, right? Because if I go back to Kohlberg, many of these things are, in a sense, ingrained through an earlier process in life. And in fact, he made a very strong one-to-one match between certain ages and the development of certain forms of morality. So the question is, can we inculcate this morality through training? What are the possible suggestions? And that's something I would love to learn from an audience like yours, because that would help me in the daily pursuit of my work. Do we need a Hippocratic oath of business? Do we need to think of business as essentially a social enterprise such that we condition managers to work through the process? I don't know. Those are some of the things I hope to hear from you. To summarize, the argument was not a very complex one and probably not at all new to you, is that business is an agent of both power and prosperity. The challenge is to channel the power for equitable, or what I call fair, prosperity. We know 4 ways to channel behavior. First is outcome control. Second is behavior control. Third is social control. And we saw that there are limitations to each of these. These are all complements in solving this problem. But a very, very important part of the problem, the solution, is what I think of as moral control and inculcating a conscience in the managers. Because the bottom line is that when an entity such as business becomes omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient, it needs to be omnimoral too, and that's the challenge that I see as part of facing our institutions, including the educational one. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for very thought-provoking presentations, and wonderfully different and also amazingly sort of overlapping in various ways. So I have the privilege of starting the conversation for about 15 minutes or so, and then we will open up and make it a wider one. And I thought I might start, just in the spirit of things not getting too mutually affirming, of challenging each of you based on something I heard emphasized in the other's presentation. So, and feel free to pitch in, both of you, but I thought I'd address the first question to you, Team Van Duzer. I was very struck by your description of business as service in the form of creating products that lead to flourishing and jobs that allow for meaningful and creative work. And I guess I have 2 questions about this. One is, that sounds wonderful, but it doesn't sound like many, many successful businesses in our time. So I think about, at least from my perspective, one of the largest retail businesses in the world, I guess, which is Walmart. And my own feeling is that Walmart neither creates particularly wonderfully flourishing goods. I don't feel that I'm flourishing when I walk into a Walmart. Now, I feel that like very efficient things are happening. I'm saving money, so I'm not necessarily not glad to be there. But I don't go to Walmart to flourish or to even necessarily to buy things that particularly help me flourish. Nor do I look around and say, these employees are in such meaningful, creative work. So I have a descriptive challenge, which is this seems so far from what an awful lot of successful business does, which seems to be to wring efficiencies out of processes in such a way that it leaves a very thin result. And then the other thing I was struck by...
Because that one wasn't enough?
That isn't enough. No, you get 2 challenges. Then the other thing I was struck by is how complex that is as a goal for managers. Compared to words that I heard, here are words I heard in Dr. Ahuja's presentation that I didn't hear in yours. It's kind of interesting. Wealth, incentive, surplus, innovation, externalities, and most interesting to me was the word markets, which was a major feature of how Dr. Ahuja described how things work, but didn't figure in how you described what business is about. And what strikes me is that all these things are highly measurable, highly actionable, whereas these standards of meaningfulness and flourishingness sound very hard even to agree on what constitutes that. So that's probably enough. What do you think?
Where to start? I believe passionately in markets. And the good that I see business doing is through markets. So there's no disagreement there. Well, let's see. Let's start with Walmart. Walmart's everybody's favorite whipping company.
I should have thought of a better one.
Yeah. And you know, over the years, they've earned some reasons for being held up to challenge. They are also, I mean, I often compare them to Costco. Costco's located in our area. Costco's often the white hat, Walmart's the black hat, the bad guys. And one of the key differences is, of course, I mean, Costco stands for all the wonderful ways that it limits its margins and cares for its customers and promotes from within and develops its employees, all those wonderful things. But Costco survives by selling really high-end items to rich people for a lower price. And Walmart makes a lot of goods available to folks who might not otherwise be able to afford them at all. And so before we jump on that too heavily, I want to at least acknowledge that that is a piece of flourishing. So that's one piece. The other thing is in the last 10, 12 years, somewhere in there, Walmart has been using its incredible market power to drive environmental improvements among its suppliers and its own stores in ways that almost no one else in the world has the power to do. So, I mean, I'm not a big Walmart defender, but it's a more nuanced question than just picking on Walmart in that sense. I think more the heart of your question, though, Andy, is what I'm saying realistic?
Yeah.
And I think it is. I'm not talking about, I mean, one of the parts that I don't have time to really develop is, while I talk about these as business purpose of service, we also talk a lot about boundary conditions. And one of the boundary conditions is some notion of sustainability across all the dimensions of the business, including sustainability vis-a-vis shareholders. So I think businesses need to be able to pay a reasonable risk-adjusted rate of return to shareholders. Otherwise, they'll take the capital, consume it, and it's not sustainable. I mean, really what will happen is they'll get kicked out of, running the company. But as a practical matter, you can't run a business without that. So I'm a believer in profitability, just not as a goal. It becomes the means of attracting, it becomes the limits, or part of the limits, but it's not the reason that business exists in society, in the philosophy that I've been promoting. So it is actually, I think there are companies out there right now, big companies, small companies, that run on a something other than profit maximizing model and seem to be doing okay. Google, for example, might be one company that would say that it doesn't adopt a strict profit maximizing model. So there are, I don't think that my suggestion that we focus on service leads you down some sort of fairyland path that, you can talk about, but you could never really do. There probably are limits that I recognize with this sort of need to be running a reasonably profitable business. And that's why I say in many cases, the decision that you might make to optimize service isn't going to be that different than optimizing profitability. It's just that sometimes they will point off in slightly different directions. And when they do, you want to know which way you're going. I'm going to stop talking because it'll take too much time, but let me give one example or parallel. This was a friend of mine shared this with me. He said that he had a friend that was a coach for coached high school basketball. And he asked his friend, why do you coach high school basketball? And the friend said, I coach high school basketball to teach character in my students. And then you watch this coach, and this coach goes nuts over trying to prepare them, running them up and down, yelling at them, training them intensely. And he goes to his friend and he says, it looks to me like you're all about winning. And the guy says, well, I mean, that's how you teach character. It's in the context of teaching this, intensely competent. Now, if you get another guy who also says, look, I'm really not about teaching character, I'm just about teaching winning. That's what I care about. Most of the time, they're going to look very similar. But there's going to be places, like when the guy's star player is out the night before and skips classes the next morning, my friend has him sit. Doesn't matter if it's the championship game, because at the end of the day, he's really not about winning. He's about character. Most of the time, they run together, but not always. So.
Yeah, it's very helpful. Thank you. So I also want to ask a challenging or probing question for you, Professor Ahuja, and it will also kind of have two parts. One is just I'd love to probe a little bit on the remarkable growth of business in those two countries you mentioned, because those graphs are so amazing. Though I did kind of wish they were log scale, because sometimes it can be a little misleading, but it is incredible, right? But it seems to me that business has flourished, and feel free to just completely contradict what I'm about to say, but it seems from my standpoint, sitting comfortably here in the US, that business has flourished in China in particular without much need for reference to moral compass. I don't think of Chinese society as inculcating or Chinese business in our lifetime as being sort of deeply based on the sense of service. I think of it actually as this amazing opening up simply of markets and space for private enterprise to grow. And so I look at all that growth and I think, well, I don't see how that has needed or been guided by a particular moral vision for management. And maybe I'm just wrong, and I'd be delighted to be corrected. The other question I had is more general, and that is actually the same list of words that you used, of wealth and incentives and surplus and innovation and so forth. These are such powerful forces for those who get a hold of them as owners and managers of business. I'm having a hard time picturing how the kind of moral sense of justice that you're calling for could ever be inculcated deeply enough to counteract just the lure of profit maximization, especially in a world where often shareholders are content for that. So that's sort of a realistic question for you. Do you think it's realistic to inculcate these kind of values deeply enough that at the moment of decision they actually make a difference?
Sure. Yeah. Well, let me take up the two questions. The first, I'll take up the China one. And the question was, is there really any kind of a moral compass that's guided Chinese business? And it doesn't appear to be so. Actually, I'll take that further. I agree with that fully, but I don't see any moral compass that's guided business in the United States or in the United Kingdom or any other place, in the sense that the truth is that markets do not function effectively or efficiently or in any other form in any way connected to moral compasses. They function because you have enough players who are willing to transact in the market, and through those transactions they create wealth. They are completely agnostic as to who earns that money and why they take it. So my take is that it's not just China that doesn't have a moral compass. I don't think business anywhere has a moral compass, and that's not, to my mind, the purpose of markets either.
Yes.
Which is why I'm separating the two tasks of wealth creation from the task of wealth distribution, which is the second part. And now to come, and I think the answer to the second question will sort of connect up these two a little bit better, which is that is it possible to inculcate a sense of morality into managers in a world in which incentives are so strong? Maybe yes, maybe not in everybody. But if we can cause that to happen, I mean, see, the point is that there are many things that we do because we get normed into believing them in certain ways. So let me just take a couple of illustrations. Supposing you were you're driving down from here to Florida, and you stop at a wayside diner. You go there, you eat, and the waitress leaves a bill for you. Would you leave a tip? That's my question. How many of you would actually leave a tip in those circumstances? Almost everybody. Okay, now let's just look at the problem from a purely hard dollars and cents perspective. What is the purpose of a tip? The purpose of a tip is to ensure better service. In fact, some say that the acronym stands for to ensure promptness. Basically, somebody came and served you, right? So the idea is, even in spite, so you have money on one hand, and you have, which can add utility to you on one side, and you have a habit or a norm that you feel awkward because you didn't do the right thing, right? Somehow we have, with tips, that has happened, right? So the point is, in some part, we are creatures not just of incentives, but also of social norms. And if we enforce those social norms, they become something of an irritant to us initially, and then eventually they are parts of what guide our behavior. So that happens in all other domains, and all I'm saying is that maybe we should be more explicit in our, inculcation of those norms by recognizing that business works well when it has a sharp edge. But that sharp edge has to be combined or complemented with a manager that is worried by or has a conscience that bothers them that, I'm not doing kind of the right thing. So at least that would be one illustration which kind of captures the idea that you don't have to have, this is an exercise that's worth doing. I fully agree that there'll be many people who will never do that when it comes to really substantive things. But the point is, if we keep working at it, more and more people will be forced to do it. And if we are explicit about it, it becomes a very, very interesting mechanism. So let me just draw attention to something. And this goes back to one of my friends who was working in a very, very profitable global company, one that has a tremendous history and record of success. And he was heading a particular region, and in that context, he was asked to do something which was completely legal, but extremely abusive of power. And this person was, this is at a time when the economy is not doing well. It's not like there are too many jobs floating around. So this person was very, very worried about what to do, but the job had to be done through the local manager who happened to be this guy. So he didn't do much about it, didn't do anything about it, and eventually one day the big boss came down from headquarters and raised the issue. Well, they went out for dinner, and then the guy raises the issue of, you haven't done this, that, everything else, all your reports came fine, but you haven't done anything about this. This guy thought a lot about it, and then he said, you know what, I'm actually not going to do it, because I don't think it's the right thing to do. And he was, obviously, this person had a family, there's a lot of baggage associated with his life at that point in time. And he says, I'm not going to do it. And it's what happened after this that really draws attention to the solution that I'm talking about. And he thought that was pretty much the end of the story. He was going to get fired, right? And he said to this guy that, Mr. X, I'm sorry, but if I presume the company does want to get this done, and it can only be done by the local manager as per local law, so I will, if you want, I can resign. And he thought, and this is what his description to me was, he says, all these years I've known this guy, he's a very hard-headed, tough guy. I said this to him, and I thought all hell will break loose. He says, for the next 45 minutes, he was the most pleasant guy I've ever met in my life. He was completely relaxed, easy. And I said, he said, I kept waiting for the axe to drop. A day went by, a week went by, months went by, nothing ever happened. So I asked him, what do you think happened? Why is it that when you said, this to this individual, why do you think nothing happened? And he says, I've been thinking about it, and I have 2 or 3 arguments which sort of explain it. He says, first of all, actually, I don't think he wanted to do it either. Right? Because in his heart of hearts, he knew that this was not the right thing to do, even though it was completely legal. He says, but given where he was in the organization, he was one step away from becoming CEO. A failure of that kind would have been very hazardous for him. So he had too much invested in the organization to be able to make that call. So when I made that call, I gave him an excuse. That if we do this, this guy will leave, and we know it's not illegal, but we don't want him talking to the press about it. So he had a story to sell, and that's why he believes it never happened. He says, because essentially what I did was I took away from him the excuse that I did not know the moral implication of what I was doing. Because that is very important for the individual to go back and sleep at night. Because he could always say, well, it was a task, I was asked to do it, I gave it to him, the guy did the task and it's over. But when you put it up front and center that this is not right, then the person has to make peace with it. So what I'm saying is that there might be a multiplicative effect if more and more people stand up and say, I am not going to do it. That's where this system could be brought into equilibrium in some fashion. But I think I've exceeded my time. So.
No, thank you. Thank you for that answer. I want to ask maybe 2 more questions that both of you could take a shot at, and then we'll open it up. I was thinking about the virulent anti-business feeling that you yourself had and encountered a generation ago or 2. And I feel like that's not the case today. I don't feel like people on the whole are virulently anti-business, but I don't feel like people are on the whole are very hopeful about business. There's kind of more of a pragmatic neutrality about it. That, well, I might have to go into business. I wondered if, let me combine this with something else, which is that I think there's a very strong sense, not least among students, that the really noble thing to do in life is to do some sort of not-for-profit work. That if you're really deeply moral, actually, that a deeply moral person would work for Teach for America or do some kind of nonprofit of some other kind. And it seems to me that actually complicates our plan to reintroduce morality into the ranks of business leaders if actually the people who most aspire to be moral are aspiring to do other things. So could you make a case for the nobility of, the sort of moral nobility and the value of aspiring to do what you train students to do? To someone who thinks, well, really what I ought to do is work not for profit. Why should I get involved in that profit stuff?
Sure. Actually, let me begin by using the illustration of Walmart. Because you said that it's not particularly, generative. Well, my take is, if you look at Walmart, and as Dean Duzer so accurately pointed out, and the people it serves, over a space of 5 to 10 years, it has probably led to the reduction of costs or prices for them by 25%. That's a 25% increase in their real income. If you can cause a 25% increase in the real income of a few 100 million people, I don't see what could be more sort of morally uplifting in some senses, right? Because again, and I'm not saying that everything Walmart does is right, or all I'm saying is that even if you take an illustration of a company that is supposedly not very generative, in doing its job well, it's actually creating a lot of value. So I think there is one part of it that is there, and the idea is that if you in some senses, we have to go back to this issue that you raised, which is, what is interesting is in many business schools, including my own, the class on ethics is part of the elective pool, right? So you can choose. And to me, that makes no sense whatsoever. Because if you are going to choose a class in, an elective class in ethics, you don't need it. So it's the person that doesn't naturally gravitate towards that has to be accounted for. So my take is that I fully respect, honor, and cherish the people that go and join a not-for-profit. I think they're doing wonderful things. But I'm equally enamored of somebody that joins a for-profit and in the process improves the lives of people by as mundane a job as every year reducing the costs in the system by 2%.
Yeah, let me just add to that. I mean, this is a perennial issue for us in our business school. We lay out this lovely model. Our students come and say, oh, we just really love this model. We buy it, and we're going to go into a not-for-profit. And I have the same kind of reaction of, well, it's good. They need good management, and I admire what not-for-profits are doing. I would echo everything that's just been said, but I would add this. The not-for-profit solution to world problems is a challenge because it cannot scale. You just never gets big enough. You can chip away at things, you can make some progress, but when you can turn in overnight and bring the huge amount of capital that business can control, your capacity to move the needle quickly goes way up. I remember hearing Muhammad Yunus speak up in our neck of the woods, and he was saying, there's two types of companies. There's the social company and the for-profit company, and they're both important, but it's really the social company. And the social company is a company that basically earns revenues, but only sufficient to basically stay afloat, doesn't have shareholders and so on. And I'm a big fan of social enterprise, and I think there's lots of places for it to play out. But his big example was one big company that had contributed $1 million to get one of these started. And, it's like, wasn't that great? And I thought, well, yeah, it's great, $1 million, that's great. But relative to the capital of the market cap of that company, it was nothing. And so if we could get large for-profit companies who say, how can I profitably, as a business, not doing just charitable little things on the side, but as a business, how could I think about deploying the resources of my business to start addressing water, food, medicine, whatever problems? Your capacity to bring so much more goes way up. So I think, we tell our students that there is no institution in society over the next 50 years that are going to shape the world we live in more than business. It's just a fact because of business owns too much of the world. And so for good or for bad, business is going to shape the world we live in. And so why not get involved and shape it for good? That would be my response.
So one last question before we open it up to lots of other questions. And I'd like to ask just a slightly more personal question for each of you, which is both of you obviously are tremendously talented folks. You've had a lot of opportunities yourself to acquire certain kinds of power, position. And we've talked about the danger that will get out of sync with one's own movement up Kohlberg's 6 levels. So I'd love to hear how, we're going to grant you the benefit of the doubt, which as a journalist maybe I shouldn't do, but I'm going to assume that you are both essentially good, trustworthy stewards of the significant power that you have, or at least on your best days you are, like all of us hope to be. And what were the 1 or 2 formative experiences in your life or your formation that gave you that internal ability to resist maybe the easy but profitable thing and do the service-oriented, flourishing thing? Just what made you that person, as near as you can tell?
Well, I'll go. First of all, I'm going to separate the two sides of this question. I do not make any claim to be a particularly moral person, so I would step away from that. Which is not to say that there have not been people in my life who have tried to make me moral. So perhaps, so my standard would be that on a good day, it's not just on a good day that I approach and try to be a good steward of the world. It's like, well, on the days that I am a good steward of the world, what I owe that to is what I'll describe. Okay, so I don't make any claim. And I can, when I said that I am not a particularly religious person, that is true, but I also happen to have had all my education, my kindergarten to 12th grade, I actually studied in a Catholic school, which was run by the Irish Christian Brothers. And So I still remember, and you asked for a formative experience, and so I'll just pick on two, one from the school context and one from my home. The school context, we had gone for a competition, and I was a very passionate quizzer, such as, you have Jeopardy and so on. In my younger days, I was very, very much a very competitive player on that stage. And one time we had gone to a tournament, and in the absolute final round, there was a question asked. I provided the answer, and the quizmaster said no, and I knew that was incorrect because I knew the answer was correct. So I then tried to explain why the quizmaster's answer was wrong. And but the quizmaster said no, and matter went on. We still won anyway. I was very excited. Okay, so I was getting off. It was a stage like this. I was getting off, and the person who was in charge of our quiz team was one of the Irish Christian brothers who was there, Brother Corbett, and he's an Irishman, very fair. But I got off, and he was very chubby, and I got off, and I saw that he was as red as a beetroot. So this is a man who's normally very fair, and he's bright red. And I was a little taken aback because this was a very, very important tournament for us to win as a school. And I got off, and I thought, instead of congratulating me, he says, Gautam, can you repeat for me the rules that the quizmaster set? And I said, sure. He said, well, every team has one response. The response must come within 15 seconds. And he said, what is rule number 3? So the quizmaster's decision would be final and binding. And he says, what part of final and binding was not clear to you? And I was obviously, at this point shaken because he was a very, very scary man too, in addition to being a very, very nice man. And then he turned around and he said to me, and I still remember that part of it very beautifully. He said, you've got to remember 2 things in life. The first is, if you accept to live by a set of rules, then it means you really have to live by them. So when the quizmaster said those rules, you should have absorbed them, and you've got to live your life by them. He says, but the second part is equally important to remember. He says, sometimes in life, it's the rules itself that you need to challenge. Now, if you can figure out which rules to accept and which to challenge, then you'll make something of your life. And so I thought that was a pretty powerful. I think I was 16 years old, which is almost more than 30 plus years ago. But so I guess on days that I am going to be extremely evil, it does come back to help me. And I think the other role, the other part that I have, which has been, at least for me, the transformative experience is actually being simply my mother's son. I lost my father at a very young age, at 5 years of age. And so my mother brought me up, pretty much. And not to put a finer point on it, a week after my father's death, we were evicted. We didn't have a home for the next 18 years. But in all those 18 years, I never saw the woman do anything that would be even, excuse me,
take your time.
Would be even remotely unacceptable. And so I wish I could be a fraction of the person that she is. But I guess on the other days when I'm going to be corrupt, that really helps me. I wish I could say that between the two of them, they saved my soul. But it was too black a soul to begin with. So that's part of it. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let me not answer it in terms of a specific event. I can think of several places in my life, usually around failures, where I thought I had it all lined up, and it didn't come my way, and it raised the question of what sort of person was I going to be in response to that. But I'll tell you the thing that has been, I think, most formative for me, and that has been my sense that I could not do this outside of a community. Certainly since I've been married, my wife and I are a community. But we've been part of a small group of other people that meets once a week and has met once a week for 30 years. We just rarely miss. And these people know me inside and out. We've been through pretty much everything in life, all the different sorts of experiences together. And I've said to them, they've said to me, in effect, look, we'd like to be more the people we were supposed to be. We'd like to be more the people that Jesus would want us to be. We want to be whole people. And we invite one another to speak into our lives if you see us starting to drift. And that's both because sometimes they've spoken into my life, but also just because I know they might. It's been very effective at sort of helping me navigate some of those things. And so I would say that's been a very formative part of it. So.
Wow. Well, thank you both very much. I've a little bit exceeded the time I was supposed to take, but we still have time for some questions from the audience. So we have 2 microphones, one at the bottom of each of those aisles, and would encourage you to come and ask questions for one or both of our presenters tonight. Great, so we'll start here.
So, Dr. Ahuja, you talk about the importance of building morality into the minds of managers, and it seems to me that many business people, even high up in business, are moral people. They act in moral ways in other areas of their lives, and they likely seek to act morally even within the role as business leaders. But it seems to me that there are sort of the rules of the system often prevent morality from being, I guess, a criterion that can be used in their decision making. So when you look at a publicly traded or publicly held corporation, it seems like there's a fiduciary duty to shareholders to maximize return on investments. And if that's sort of the rules that govern the system, I wonder how you can import sort of values-based decisions that might minimize or lessen return on investments. And I wonder if a distinction needs to be made between privately held companies and publicly traded corporations, in the sense that if you own your own business, or if it's privately held, you have the freedom to sort of widen your scope of criterion that you use to make decisions. Whereas with a publicly traded corporation, because of the shareholder relationship, I wonder if that freedom exists.
Great question.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I fully agree with you that this fiduciary duty requires the manager to do the right thing by the shareholder. But I think the fiduciary duty has a broader ambit than just maximizing the return in a given period of time. The manager's job, in some senses, is to maximize the shareholder's value, right, over a period of time, in the sense that if the manager does the right things, that should get impounded in the stock price in over a longer period of time. So in some senses, there is that dimension, that it is not single period maximization. So what may appear to be a good decision to save costs in the short run may turn out to be a terrible decision in the long run. So those things are, in any case, consistent with the role of shareholder value maximization. But I think the basic issue that you draw attention to is one that is very deeply difficult, and it's not just because of the fiduciary aspect of it. There's another, what I would call contextual aspect of it, which is very important too. In a public limited company, what you have is the separation of ownership from control. The manager that makes the decision is not usually the shareholder that actually benefits in principle from that decision. What this does is it facilitates the development of an amoral, so to speak, decision-making apparatus, because what it does is it says the manager gets to go home and say, I didn't do anything wrong because I never stole anything for myself, I just did it for the shareholder. The shareholder gets to say, well, I wasn't doing anything, so I'm not responsible either. So the point is that the structure of the modern corporation makes it very easy to divorce responsibility from authority, and that is a problem. And again, making managers cognizant of that is very much a part of the the approach that I would suggest, is that they have to be responsible for their actions, and shareholders should not be left off the hook too. So, but unfortunately, for economic reasons, that's a structure we need. But we have to come around and accept the limitations that it kind of brings with it, but try and fix it through these other mechanisms that I talk about.
Do you think there's a need for sort of a changing of the rules, though, in order to allow, I guess, sort of managers to make those sorts of decisions? Or do you think they really could do it if they truly wanted to?
Yeah. See, the most obvious rule change that people talk about is, well, instead of having fiduciary duty to the shareholders, we should have fiduciary duty to the stakeholders, right? So we must manage not just the shareholders' interest, but also the interests of the others. The problem with that is that it becomes very difficult to execute or implement. If a manager goes through a particular year and comes back to me, and I told him to manage stakeholder value as opposed to shareholder value, and he comes back and tells me, well, my buyers are very happy, my suppliers are very happy, and too bad I didn't get much money left over for you, but hey, I took care of 2 of the 3 stakeholders, so I should get 2/3 of my bonus. Now the problem is, I'm left wondering, did the 3rd stakeholder get short-shrifted because the manager was inefficient and could have created value but didn't, or did they get short-shrifted because the other 2 were rightly assigned values? And I have no way of separating the 2. So eventually, in a system in which you try to maximize the value for stakeholders, the concept is so ambiguous that you end up maximizing nothing, right? Because we've been through that in many of the socialist economies. The India and China that I represented, and the India that I grew up in, had a huge state-owned sector whose job was to try and look at, was to do things for stakeholders in general. Unfortunately, it ended up creating no value for anybody. Yeah.
We'll alternate aisles as much as we can.
Thank you for all being here tonight. I really appreciate it. My question is, I recognize, or I value, that trust is one of our most valuable commodities. With our actually growing marketplace and being more globalized, I recognize that sometimes, in our financial crisis, people feel more entitled or don't view businesses or corporations or governments as having human elements. So I feel like we're stripping away the human elements of businesses or governments by viewing them as, that bank was charging me too much interest, where recognizing that's somebody's pension fund or somebody's, retirement account, or viewing, that's the Republican Party or Democratic Party versus, there's unique individuals where, people have lives and, favorite colors and pets and whatnot. So how do we, I guess, or you propose in both your philosophies of, I guess, keeping the individuality and the human element of both trust and character in business and in society through business?
Well, I agree that that is a challenge, that there is a tendency to want to see business in monolithic terms. And in part, business, I think, serves this up. And so people react to it, in a sense, to some extent, the way it portrays itself. I don't think that most people are strict, sheer profit maximizers, short or long term. I don't think most of us would want to live in a world where that is truly at play at every stage. I think many times managers will make decisions that seem right, that aren't maybe the most proper. But we have a kind of a mantra that this is what business does, this is how they run, this is what they're about. And so to some extent, I think that does, when you hear that and look at that from the outside, your inclination may be to say, well, that's not something I like very much, and it can diminish trust. On the other hand, I mean, the trust factors, there's Edelman Trust Barometer measures trust in various institutions, and it goes up and down. Right now, business way ahead of government, if that gives you any concept.
More the sense of, I guess, thinking about maybe back in the day, and I wasn't around 100 years ago or what, with more localized economies and localized markets and localized governments, how people would have a more sense of community and trust and knowing people and valuing that, it's not just the grocery stores, but it's, Stan's Market or whatever, where it wasn't necessarily just about corporations and governments, it was more about individuals and families. And I guess how can we preserve that, or how can we, I guess instill that value within, like, especially in the consumer's mentality, where it's like, I just go to Walmart and that's just a person that's checking me out versus, this is a kind of a human transaction happening versus just a financial transaction.
I understand the challenge that you're posing. I sort of applaud folks who have found ways to create sort of local economies, a kind of Wendell Berry sort of orientation. I don't think it's viable in any sort of big sense. I don't think it solves the problem of poverty around the world. I think it's often a plaything for people who can afford it. I think the idea of local economies, if we all went back to local economies, we have a somewhat idyllic picture of what that looked like, and it really wasn't pretty. And that's one of the reasons many of us wanted to move beyond. So I totally embrace sort of this sense of values and the lack of connectedness, where I can't tell where my product came from and how it was made, and this sort of eerie sense of isolation that creates. I really get it. And there are small scale sort of experiments, local farmers market, that kind of stuff, which I think is great and helps reinforce that. But I don't think it's a long-term solution. I think to some extent maybe this goes back more to the internal that we're talking about.
We will try to get to the questions of everyone who's standing right now, and that will be about what we'll have time to do. So let's go to the side.
I just have a question. Since you guys are both at different business schools, one secular and one not, what is it about the ethics component of the business school that, specifically at Seattle Pacific, for instance, that gives it teeth? I mean, it seems like all business schools have some kind of corporate social responsibility commitments, and even if Michigan doesn't, a lot of secular ones require ethics. What distinguishes managers, like if they get compensation packages that are irresponsible, do they have to return their degree, or if they authorize environmentally unsustainable practices?
They have to give it to the business school. We don't have any enforcement mechanisms after the fact. We take it seriously. We have 2 mandatory classes in our MBA program on business ethics. We have a capstone class at our undergraduate level is on business ethics. We tell every faculty member that they are expected to raise questions of ethics and values in their courses, and we ask every student at the end of every course to evaluate how well their faculty member did on that. I read all those evaluations and then meet with the faculty members. So, I mean, we are serious about trying to ingrain this. We also, as we've sort of have been developing this business philosophy, we've been trying to drill it down, and this is really where it gets tough. If you're teaching finance, or you're teaching marketing, or you're teaching, and you start with this sort of business as service premise, what implications does it make? Where are the changes that you need to come? And I wouldn't claim that we've done, we're anywhere near the end of that process or done a great job at it, but we're trying to press this in kind of across the curriculum. At the end of the day, we do sort of some hokey assessment exercises around the ethics of our students, but really, truly, I mean, these are internal changes that we are inviting them. I think one thing I would say is that we do keep it in front of their face. It's not easy to sort of just say, oh, they have to deal with it. Now, whether they deal with it well is maybe a different question.
What I would like to suggest we do is actually hear several questions, or perhaps all the remaining questions from folks who are standing, because we may hear some common themes, and then give each of you a chance to respond to the themes you've heard. So we'll get to hear what all of you are wanting to pose. We may not be able to answer them all in depth, but we can hear how they sort of weave together to raise some final questions for our 2 presenters. So we'll just go back and forth, starting with the right aisle.
Okay. Thank you very much for talking about your experiences. 2 of the things I'm really passionate about is entrepreneurship, and also just following God. So as coming into Michigan as a freshman, I've been doing everything to approach entrepreneurship. So Empowered and entrepreneurship. I'm writing case studies in entrepreneurship for one of your professors, Dr. Anuradha Nagarajan, and my question is, as an entrepreneur, I'm almost forced to focus on profit maximization to even survive in this competitive environment. Excuse me. So I'm trying to see what, on your opinion, what's the cutoff point where it's not all about profit maximization? I can start focusing on helping the society, and also as a follower of Christ, how do I stay self-controlled and try not to be greedy, or how to what's the balance point, and what's your opinion on that?
Great.
Hi. I heard both of you talk about the need for a driving force to combat the attractiveness of simply for-profit desire. And I also heard you both talk about the need for morality to be a part of that. But I think I recognized a fundamental difference in the moralities that you're talking about. Professor Van Duzen, I heard you talk about a morality that's outward-focused, that's more service-focused, looking at the community around, looking at other people, maybe even encountering circumstances where you decide whether you're going to empower other people, or empower your own company, or whether you're going to do something that's good for other people, so it's almost kind of sacrifice. And Professor Ahuja, I heard you talk about maybe more of an individual-focused morality. You talked about image and self-condemnation and things. I was wondering if you guys thought that there was a fundamental difference between those two. Is one more effective? Is one more attractive? Is one more practical than the other?
All right, thank you.
Hi, I guess my question for both of you is that I feel like today we live in a world where just as much as profit maximization, a business needs public support to run, and part of having public support is winning over the public. And I feel like a lot of companies put on charity work and other activities to try to improve their image. But I feel like a lot of it is done in a reactionary measure to kind of mitigate some of the negative attention they get. And I guess I was wondering, first of all, do you see that as a problem in today's business structure? And secondly, do we as a society have an obligation to stand up for our own interests as a society, to kind of make businesses accountable for upholding moral standards for the right reasons?
Thank you.
I think my question real quick is just, I guess, for both of you is, I think we talked a lot about human flourishing, all that kind of stuff, and just really simply what each of your definitions of human flourishing is, pretty simply. And on top of that, I think at least Professor Van Duzer, you mentioned that business is an institution that has a lot of power to change and allow for these flourishing kind of things to happen. I think Professor Ahuja, similarly, you just both spoke of, I guess, the power of business. And in that, I was wondering if there's anything you feel as if is missing from that power that goes into that sense of human flourishing, whatever your definition may be. I guess, is there something that business cannot do? And if so, what those things might be? And in the same right, what business is able to do for those things? So, yeah.
I hope you all are getting all of these questions, and we'll
a lot of
address them
things.
all in your summaries. Yes.
Hi. So my question is, if you look at the history of banking, a lot of people claim that stuff like credit, stuff like low interest loans, was originally established by Christian groups or Christian communities, and it has been said that a lot of the fundamental morality, as Dr. Ahuja mentioned, was based on the religious faith, and through their faith is where they get that morality to try to use their financial powers to do something positive in the world. Do you think that there's a place for that same religious morality to innovate the financial structure that we have today?
All right. Yes, two more.
Hi. So this question's a little bit of a more personal question. It's more directed towards Dr. Ahuja. I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for talking about China. I'm not a business major, never really studied business, but I did spend 4 months in China there, and I guess in my time there, I saw a lot of the recent scramble of trying to become really on top of business. I saw a lot of people trying to really just catch up to different standards than what China has been living in. And I guess a question I have for you is, during my time there, I saw a lot of probably corruption either on a personal level or on an institutional level. As a Christian, my response to that is a lot of prayer. My response to a lot of the people using that power abusively was just prayer and just a lot of spending time connecting with my coworkers and asking them why are they doing the things that they're doing. I guess as a Christian, I kind of view it as sin and as evil. As someone with a different worldview, how do you reconcile things like that when you see it? Just from your own personal life, when you see corruption or abuse of power, you had said earlier that business is already playing God, but what happens when people use that power abusively? How do you reconcile that? If I have non-Christian friends, how do I encourage them? How do I empower them? And how do people not get depressed in the world when they see a lot of right, when they see a lot of these kinds of things? And I recognize this is a personal question, so yeah. I understand that, but that's just something that I've been trying to reconcile in my mind. My background is a little bit more in the social work, social justice area, but I just would like to hear what your opinions and thoughts about that are.
Thank you. And one more.
Hi, so I kind of want to focus on business education, and I remember hearing Dr. Van Duzer say at Seattle Pacific, you kind of have a tagline, but as a business student at Ross, we don't have a required ethics course, which you mentioned about earlier, and we're so focused on, finance, NPV, ROI, and then even marketing strategies, which you prime your consumers without them even knowing to buy your product. And I remember the first module in marketing, the first chapter of the textbook was about ethics, which we completely skipped over. And I apologize to Professor McFerrin there, but I just kind of want to understand how you really want to institute. It sounds really great, and I'm a Christian too, so I would love to see it happen, but how exactly do you plan on instituting this kind of morality education in our business school, especially at Ross? Thank you.
So I'm going to change my assignment for each of you. Rather than asking you to address how you will instill ethics while responding to corruption, making a place for religiously based enterprise and financial innovation, defining human flourishing, and defining your differences in how you approach morality. Maybe we will not ask you to address everything we said, but it is a great prompt for sticking around with the snacks and drinks that will be provided afterwards, because we have a lot to talk about, right? And these are fantastic questions that have been raised. I have a different request of each of you. This has been a very rich time. What question or observation, but especially what question are you leaving with if you stood at one of those microphones at the end of tonight? What are you wondering about as we finish tonight? And maybe, Dr. Ahuja, we could start with you, and then Dean Van Duzer.
Yeah, I think there were two questions that really stood out for me, and I think I have the inklings of the answer to one, and maybe a very, very small inkling to the answer to the second. The first is that the first question that was kind of there, which I have a sense was the question raised by the person who's an entrepreneur, in terms of when do I know that I have to move beyond profit maximization? And I think that's a really wonderful question. I'm not sure I have a complete answer to it, but I do have at least a partial response to it, which is the answer is never. Part of business's job is to make sure that you make money. But the point is, it's how you make money that we ask questions of, or should be asking questions of. So for that, basically, at least my response would be that we need to, what you have to, the line that I use sometimes in class is that for every answer, for every question that business raises for you, think with your mind and analyze it completely, but the action must come from your heart. So if your heart is telling you this is not the right thing to do, then it doesn't matter whether it's maximizing profit or not. You don't need a deep framework to tell you that. If your heart tells you something, usually it does the job pretty accurately. But then it's the second question and the juxtapositioning of these questions that bothers me, which is that the way our heart tells us that something is right or wrong is because it's over a period of time been socialized to do so in certain ways. I'm sure that there is some inherent level of morality born in most of us, but that level is usually sort of, developed and fostered in some fashion. So what do you do if in a whole society that norm itself has gotten demolished? Because what you're telling me is that if you spend time in India or China, and you said China, but I will add India to it too, is that if you have if corruption becomes an accepted mode of life, then clearly we have a long problem that's a very, very big problem. How do you resolve that? Because my first answer then is no longer operative because there is no standard norm out there to present it. So then it comes back to how do we develop those norms? And that's not a question that I have an easy answer for. Maybe I have some fragments of an answer, but it would take me a very long time to be able to articulate it in any sensible way. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
I think the thing that for me is there is tremendous power in business and in some of our current structures and paradigms. The profit-making, profit-maximizing model has a lot of wonderful things to say for it. I mean, certainly profit-making. It's the juice that runs the engine. It also is a very, very, it's very easy, I mean, relative to some of these other standards, very easy to measure. You're maximizing a single variable over some period of time. One of my faculty members is a PhD in mathematics, and he says that in fact, we can't really measure, and so we substitute short-term for long-term and make approximations and so forth. But it has at least the illusion of being the kind of thing that you can measure. You can win or lose, and that's a part of the appeal, I think, to a lot of people in business. So the combination of how critical it is to running the business and how, in some ways, relatively straightforward it is to measure, how we have years and years of accounting systems designed to let us compare companies apples to apples, where we don't have that on other measures. The danger is always that it will, no matter what we say up front, it will take over. In my model, service is your first question, but you have to ask, can I do it profitably? Relative to the risk, relative to the expected, reasonable expectations of return. And I worry constantly, really, that the impetus to earn the profit is so hard to generate. I mean, running a business is really hard stuff to do, that in fact, that becomes, you just drop off that first question because you're just spending so much of your time on the second question. And so for me, one of the questions is, how do we keep front and center what we really want to be about? It's a broad question, I suppose, in life, but particularly in business, how do we keep front and center that which we went into this, that's why we're doing this, that's what we hope to accomplish with this. How do we not lose sight of that in the really intense day-to-day activities of running a business?
Wow. And that's a question not just for people in business, but for all of us. Yeah. Thank you all so much for your fantastic questions, your attention, and let's thank our presenters.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.